The auction block at the front of the trading post in Dallas, Texas, loomed like a gallows in the dying light of a sun-scorched afternoon as Theresa Foster clutched the torn fabric of her dress, her knuckles white with silent fury. The year was 1875, and the shame of her family had become a commodity with a price tag, one that would be settled before nightfall. "Next up, gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the crowd of dusty cowboys, gamblers, and businessmen gathered in the sweltering heat. "A fine woman to serve your household needs. Miss Theresa Foster, 20 years of age, healthy and strong. Her father's debts must be settled, and she's been offered as payment." Theresa's cheeks burned with humiliation as she stood on the wooden platform, but she refused to lower her gaze. Her father's gambling debts and subsequent suicide had left their family farm mortgaged beyond redemption. Her mother had succumbed to consumption 2 winters prior, leaving Theresa and her younger brother and sister at the mercy of creditors who showed none. Mason Quinn observed the proceedings from the back of the crowd, his weathered hat pulled low over piercing blue eyes. At 32, he'd seen his fair share of injustice on the frontier, but the practice of settling debts with human lives still turned his stomach. His hand rested on the considerable weight of coins in his pocket, earnings from a successful cattle drive to Kansas City. "Bidding starts at $50, the auctioneer continued. "Who'll give me 50 for this fine young woman? Think of the cooking, cleaning, and companionship, gentlemen." The suggestive tone wasn't lost on the crowd. Several men raised their hands, including Everett Sullivan, the owner of the largest saloon in Dallas. His reputation for cruelty toward his employees was well known throughout the county. $50 from Mr. Sullivan, the auctioneer nodded. "Do I hear 60? 60, called a voice from Mason's left. The bidding continued, quickly reaching $100. Sullivan's face grew red with determination, his thick fingers clutching a glass of whiskey as he raised the bid to $120. $120 from Mr. Sullivan. "Do I hear 130? Theresa stood still as stone, her eyes fixed on a distant point on the horizon. She had promised her siblings 12-year-old Thomas and 10-year-old Elizabeth that she would find a way to keep them together. The promise felt hollow now as she faced a future of servitude or worse. $200, Mason called out, his voice clear and steady. A murmur rippled through the crowd as heads turned to identify the new bidder. $200 from the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer announced with renewed enthusiasm. "Do I hear 220? Sullivan squinted at Mason, recognition dawning on his face. "That's Quinn, the cattleman," he muttered to his companion. $250, he shouted. $300, Mason countered without hesitation. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Few men in Dallas could afford to spend such sums casually. Sullivan's face contorted with anger. $350. $500, Mason said, stepping forward through the parting crowd. Silence fell over the gathering. Even the auctioneer seemed momentarily stunned. $500 once, he recovered quickly. $500 twice. Sullivan cursed under his breath but remained silent. Sold to Mr. Quinn for $500. For the first time, Theresa's composure faltered. Her eyes met Mason's, confusion and fear mingling with a flicker of hope. What would this stranger demand in exchange for such a sum? Mason approached the platform, removing his hat as he addressed the auctioneer. "I'll need papers drawn up," he said quietly. "Not of ownership, but of debt clearance." The auctioneer frowned. "Sir, the customary transaction—" "I'm not interested in custom," Mason interrupted. "I'm paying her father's debts. The lady's freedom is her own." Theresa's eyes widened. She stepped back involuntarily as Mason approached, offering her his hand to help her down from the platform. "Miss Foster," he said, his voice lowered for her ears alone, I have no claim on you. Your father's debts are settled. Theresa hesitated, suspicion evident in her expression. Why would you do this? What do you want in return? Nothing you're not willing to give, Mason replied. Let's discuss it away from prying eyes. With the transaction completed and the papers signed, Mason led Theresa away from the trading post. The evening air offered little relief from the day's heat as they walked toward a small cafe at the end of the main street. My brother and sister, Theresa said urgently once they were seated at a corner table. They're staying with the blacksmith's family until my situation was resolved. I need to go to them. And you shall, Mason assured her, but first let me explain my proposition. Proposition, Theresa repeated flatly. So there is a price. Mason's eyes softened. Not the kind you're thinking. I run a cattle ranch about 20 miles outside of town. The Double Q, it's called. I've been looking for a housekeeper, someone to cook for the hands and keep the main house in order. A housekeeper, Theresa said cautiously, with fair wages and your own quarters in the main house. Your siblings would be welcome too. The boy is old enough to help with chores, and the girl can attend the school we've established for the ranch children. Theresa's fingers tightened around the cup of coffee the waitress had placed before her. Why would you do this for strangers? Mason was silent for a moment, his eyes distant with memory. I once knew someone in a similar situation. Nobody helped her. He returned his gaze to Theresa. I'm offering employment, Miss Foster, not charity and certainly not ownership. And if I refuse, then I'll give you enough money to take your brother and sister elsewhere and start fresh. Your father's debts are settled either way. Theresa studied him carefully. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. There was nothing in his expression that triggered alarm, yet experience had taught her to be wary. I accept the position, she said finally, but I need your word that my siblings will be safe. You have it, Mason replied. We'll collect them tomorrow morning. Tonight, you can stay at the boarding house across the street. I've already arranged a room. True to his word, Mason appeared the next morning with a wagon. Theresa had spent a restless night weighing her options, finding them few. The money Mason had offered if she declined his employment would not last long, and jobs for women with 2 young dependents were scarce. The position at his ranch represented stability if his intentions were honorable. They collected Thomas and Elizabeth from the blacksmith's home. The children were subdued, their young faces already bearing the marks of worry beyond their years. Thomas stood protectively beside his sister, eyeing Mason with suspicion. Mr. Quinn has paid father's debts, Theresa explained gently. We're going to work at his ranch, all of us. Elizabeth asked, her small voice hopeful. All of you, Mason confirmed, crouching to meet the child's eyes. There's even a school for you to attend and other children to play with. The journey to the Double Q passed largely in silence. The siblings huddled together in the back of the wagon, while Mason drove and occasionally pointed out landmarks or shared brief information about the ranch. That rise ahead marks the beginning of my property, he said as they crested a hill in the late afternoon. The ranch house is just beyond those trees. Theresa's breath caught as the Double Q came into view. The main house was larger than she had expected, a 2-story structure of solid timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Nearby stood a bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings. Men on horseback moved in the distance, driving cattle across verdant pastureland that stretched to the horizon. It's beautiful, Elizabeth whispered, her first word since they'd departed Dallas. As they approached, a middle-aged woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. That's Mrs. Holbrook, Mason explained. She's been keeping house since my wife died 3 years ago, but she's eager to return to her daughter in Austin now that her grandchildren have arrived. Theresa felt a pang of sympathy at the mention of Mason's deceased wife, but it was quickly replaced by understanding. His motivation became clearer. He genuinely needed a housekeeper. Mrs. Holbrook welcomed them warmly, showing no surprise at the arrival of 3 strangers. "I've prepared the East Wing rooms as you requested, Mr. Quinn," she said. "Supper will be ready in an hour." The accommodations exceeded Theresa's expectations. She and Elizabeth would share a spacious bedroom with 2 beds, while Thomas had a smaller adjoining room to himself. The windows overlooked a kitchen garden and beyond it, rolling hills dotted with cattle. "These are very fine quarters for servants," Theresa observed when Mason showed them the rooms. "You're employees, not servants," he corrected. "And I believe in providing properly for my people." Over the following days, Theresa settled into her role at the Double Q. Mrs. Holbrook stayed for a week, teaching her the routines of the household and introducing her to the ranch hands. There were 12 men who lived in the bunkhouse, plus the foreman, Samuel Winters, who occupied a small cabin near the main house with his wife and 3 children. The work was demanding but fair. Theresa rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for the hands, managed the household through the day, and ensured dinner was served promptly at 6. Elizabeth began attending the small schoolhouse, where Mrs. Winters taught 8 children ranging in age from 6 to 13. Thomas, eager to prove his worth, divided his time between school and helping with ranch chores. Mason himself was often absent during daylight hours, riding out with the men to tend to the cattle, or meeting with business associates in neighboring towns. When present, he was unfailingly polite, but maintained a respectful distance that both relieved and, surprisingly to Theresa, somewhat disappointed her. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after their arrival, Theresa found Mason on the porch after the hands had returned to the bunkhouse. He sat in a wooden chair, a ledger open on his lap, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Would you care for some coffee, Mr. Quinn?" she offered, lingering in the doorway. He looked up, seemingly surprised by the interruption. "That would be very welcome, Miss Foster, thank you." She returned moments later with 2 cups, offering one to him before taking a seat in the adjacent chair. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. "How are you and your siblings settling in?" Mason asked, closing his ledger. "Very well, thank you. Elizabeth adores school and Thomas has become fast friends with your foreman's oldest boy." Mason nodded. "Sam mentioned Thomas has a good head for numbers. He's been helping with the tally counts." "He always was clever that way," Theresa said with pride. She hesitated before adding, "I wanted to thank you properly for everything you've done for us." "There's no need, there is," she insisted. "You saved us from a fate I cannot bear to contemplate. You've given us a home, purpose, dignity. I don't know how we can repay such kindness." Mason's eyes met hers, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. "Your work here is payment enough," he said finally. "You're an excellent housekeeper." "Is that all I am?" The question slipped out before Theresa could stop it. The air between them seemed to still. Mason set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "What else would you wish to be, Miss Foster?" Theresa felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I only meant, sometimes I feel there must have been more to your decision that day, more than simply needing household help." Mason was silent for so long that Theresa began to regret her boldness. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "My sister was sold to cover my father's gambling debts when I was 16, and she was 18. I was away working a cattle drive, sending money home. By the time I returned, it was too late. She died less than a year later in a brothel in San Antonio. Theresa's hand flew to her mouth. I'm so sorry. I couldn't save her, Mason continued, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. But when I saw you on that auction block, I saw a chance to right a wrong that's haunted me for 16 years. So it was guilt, Theresa said softly. Mason turned to her. At first, perhaps. But these weeks, watching you rebuild a life for yourself and your siblings with such grace and determination. I admire you, Miss Foster, far more than is appropriate between employer and employee. The admission hung in the air between them, fraught with possibility and complication. Theresa's heart quickened as she recognized the truth in his words and in her own feelings that had been growing since that first day. Perhaps, she said carefully, we should discuss what might be appropriate. The summer heat gave way to autumn's gentle cooling as life at the Double Q fell into comfortable rhythms. Theresa's role evolved beyond mere housekeeping as she began to take on more responsibilities in the running of the ranch. Mason sought her counsel on household expenditures, then gradually on broader ranch matters. Their evening conversations on the porch became a cherished ritual. They spoke of books they had read, of Mason's travels during his younger years, of Theresa's dreams for her siblings' futures. Sometimes they sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. The ranch hands noticed the changing dynamic between them, exchanging knowing glances when their boss lingered at the breakfast table or when Miss Foster's cheeks flushed at the mention of Mr. Quinn. Samuel Winter's wife, Clara, became a confidante to Theresa, offering gentle encouragement. He hasn't looked at anyone that way since Caroline died, Clara told her one afternoon as they picked vegetables from the kitchen garden. It's good to see life returning to his eyes. We've only known each other a few months, Theresa protested, and I'm his employee. Love doesn't always follow a proper timeline, Clara replied with a smile, and employment arrangements can change. On a crisp October morning, Mason announced he needed to travel to Fort Worth on business. I'll be gone 3 days, he told Theresa as she poured his coffee. Would your brother and sister like to accompany me? There's a traveling fair in town. It might be a welcome diversion for the children. Theresa's surprise must have shown on her face, for he quickly added, Clara Winters would join us as chaperone, of course. I wouldn't want to cause any impropriety. The gesture touched her deeply, not only his consideration for her siblings' enjoyment, but his concern for her reputation. They would love that, she said. As would I. The trip to Fort Worth proved transformative for their relationship. While the children marveled at the fair's attractions, Mason and Theresa walked together through the bustling streets, their conversation flowing more freely away from the watchful eyes of the ranch. He purchased small gifts for Thomas and Elizabeth, and when Theresa admired a blue silk ribbon in a shop window, he insisted on buying it for her despite her protests. That evening, after the children had gone to bed in their hotel room under Clara's supervision, Mason invited Theresa to join him for a late supper in the hotel's small restaurant. The setting was more elegant than she was accustomed to, and she felt suddenly conscious of her simple dress. You look beautiful, Mason said, reading her discomfort. The ribbon suits you perfectly. Theresa touched the blue silk she had woven into her braid. Thank you, not just for the ribbon, but for today. I haven't seen Thomas and Elizabeth so carefree in years. They're remarkable children, Mason said. You've raised them well through unimaginable difficulty. I did what any sister would do. No, Mason shook his head. What you've done goes far beyond ordinary obligation, your strength, your dignity, even on that auction block. I've never met anyone like you, Theresa. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent a pleasant shiver through her. "Mason," she replied in kind, testing the sound of his name on her lips. "I need to ask you something that's been troubling me. Anything. That day in Dallas when you bought my freedom, several men at the auction knew you. They called you the cattleman. Were you in town specifically for the auction?" Mason set down his fork, his expression serious. "No, I was there to meet with a banker about expanding the ranch." The auction was circumstance, or providence perhaps, and you decided on a moment's notice to spend $500 on a stranger. "It wasn't entirely impulsive," Mason admitted. "I'd seen you in town the day before with your siblings. You were at the general store, counting pennies to buy supplies. I overheard the shopkeeper mentioning the auction to another customer after you left." Theresa absorbed this information. "So you had already noticed me?" "Yes," Mason said simply. "I had." The air between them seemed charged with unspoken feelings. Mason reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Theresa, I don't want to rush you or make you uncomfortable. Your position at the ranch is secure regardless of anything else between us. But I need you to know that my feelings for you have grown far beyond admiration." Theresa turned her hand beneath his, their fingers intertwining. "As have mine for you." The return journey to the Double Q was filled with a new awareness between them. Clara Winters observed with quiet approval, keeping the children occupied while Mason and Theresa exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Life at the ranch continued, but with subtle shifts in their relationship. Mason began joining Theresa and the children for evening meals, rather than eating with the hands as had been his custom. On Sundays, they rode together to the small church in the nearest town, presenting a picture that caused more than one local to wonder if the eligible rancher had finally found a new wife. November brought the first frost and preparations for winter. The cattle were moved to sheltered pastures, supplies were stocked, and the main house was made snug against the coming cold. One evening, as Theresa mended clothes by the fire, Mason entered the sitting room with unusual hesitancy. "May I speak with you?" he asked, remaining standing even as she gestured to the chair opposite hers. "Of course. Is something wrong?" "Not wrong, no." He drew a deep breath. "I've received a letter from the bank in Dallas. They're foreclosing on your family's farm." Theresa's hand stilled. "I expected as much. We haven't been able to make payments since Father died. The property will be auctioned next month," Mason continued. "I thought you should know. Thank you for telling me." Theresa resumed her stitching, though her fingers trembled slightly. "It's just land now. Our home is here." Mason knelt beside her chair, gently taking the mending from her hands. "What if it could be yours again? The farm, I mean." Theresa frowned in confusion. "That's impossible." "The debts, I could pay them," Mason said. "Buy the farm at auction and sign it over to you and your siblings." "It's your birthright." "Mason, no." Theresa shook her head firmly. "You've done more than enough for us already. I couldn't accept such a gift." "What if it wasn't a gift?" His voice had grown softer. "What if it was part of our shared future?" Theresa's breath caught as understanding dawned. "What are you saying?" Mason took her hands in his. "I'm saying, rather poorly, that I love you, Theresa Foster. I've loved you since I saw you standing proud despite everything you'd endured. I want to build a life with you here at your family's farm, wherever you wish to be." "Are you proposing marriage?" Theresa whispered. "I am." Mason smiled, a hint of nervousness in his expression. "I know it hasn't been long and your circumstances when we met were coerced. If you need more time—" "No," Theresa interrupted. "I don't need more time to know my own heart. I love you too, Mason. I have for weeks now." Relief and joy transformed his features. "Then you'll marry me?" "Yes," she said, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. but not because of the farm or what you've done for us. Because of who you are, the man who saw value in me when the world saw only a commodity." Mason drew her into his arms, his kiss gentle at first, then deepening with the passion they had both restrained for months. When they finally parted, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "We should tell Thomas and Elizabeth," he said. The children's reactions exceeded their expectations. Elizabeth flung her arms around Mason's neck, declaring she had always wanted a big brother, while Thomas offered a solemn handshake that quickly transformed into an embrace when Mason pulled him into a hug. "Does this mean you're going to be our guardian now?" Thomas asked, practical as always. "It means I'll be your brother-in-law officially," Mason replied, "but I hope to be much more than that to both of you." The wedding was planned for Christmas Eve. Word spread quickly throughout the county, and preparations became a community affair. The ranch hands constructed additional tables for the feast. Clara Winters and the other ranch wives organized the cooking, and the children created decorations from pine boughs and red ribbons. As the day approached, an unexpected visitor arrived at the double queue. Theresa was in the kitchen supervising the baking of wedding cakes when she heard the sound of an approaching buggy. Looking out the window, she saw a well-dressed older man stepping down from the vehicle, his bearing that of someone accustomed to respect. Mason met the visitor on the porch. Their conversation appeared tense from what Theresa could observe through the window. When Mason finally brought the man inside, his expression was carefully neutral. "Theresa, this is Judge William Harrington from Dallas," Mason introduced them. "Judge, my fiancée, Miss Theresa Foster." The judge removed his hat, revealing silver hair and shrewd eyes that assessed Theresa with open curiosity. "Miss Foster, I've heard much about you. Judge Harrington is here regarding your father's estate," Mason explained. "Perhaps we should sit down." In the sitting room, the judge removed papers from his leather portfolio. "Miss Foster, I was your father's attorney before his death. I've been attempting to locate you and your siblings for several months." "For what purpose?" Theresa asked, a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. "Could there be more debts they hadn't known about? To inform you of certain facts that were misrepresented to you." The judge glanced at Mason. "Facts that Mr. Quinn has recently discovered through his inquiries about your family's farm." "What facts?" Theresa's voice sharpened. The judge cleared his throat. "Your father's debts were largely fabricated by his business partner, Howard Daniels. After your father's death, Daniels altered loan documents and forged your father's signature on promissory notes. When I discovered the discrepancies, Daniels had already fled to Mexico with a substantial sum from your father's accounts." Theresa sat in stunned silence as the judge continued. "The auction in Dallas was illegal. You were never Daniels' property to sell. I've been building a case against the auctioneer and those involved, but by the time I gathered sufficient evidence, you had disappeared. So her family farm," Mason began, "is still legally hers with only a fraction of the debt that was claimed," the judge confirmed. "The foreclosure notice was premature and has been withdrawn. Miss Foster, your father left the property to you and your siblings free and clear. There is even a modest sum in the bank that Daniels was unable to access." Theresa's mind reeled with the implications. All those months of fear and shame, the desperation that had driven her to accept being sold like livestock, all based on a cruel deception. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would Daniels do this?" "Your father discovered he had been embezzling from their business," the judge explained. "Daniels knew he would face prison when the evidence came to light. By eliminating your father and discrediting your family, he sought to cover his crimes. And no one questioned this." Theresa's voice rose with indignation. No one defended our family's honor. The judge had the grace to look ashamed. Many were complicit in their silence, myself included at first. It wasn't until I examined the documents more closely that I realized what had happened. By then, Daniels had orchestrated your sale. Mason's hand found Theresa's, squeezing gently in support. What happens now, Judge? Miss Foster's property is restored to her name. The authorities are searching for Daniels in Mexico. As for those who participated in the illegal auction, he hesitated. That includes you, Mr. Quinn, technically speaking, though your intentions were clearly honorable. I purchased her freedom, not her person, Mason stated firmly. Indeed, which is why I've recommended no charges be brought against you. The judge turned back to Theresa. Miss Foster, I deeply regret the injustice you and your siblings suffered. The courts of Texas have failed your family, and for that, I personally apologize. After the judge departed, Theresa remained in the sitting room, the property deeds spread before her on the table. Mason sat beside her, watching her process this radical shift in her circumstances. You're a woman of independent means now, he said finally. Your future is yours to determine. Theresa looked up, noting the carefully neutral tone of his voice. You think this changes things between us, doesn't it? You no longer need my protection or employment. Your family's honor is restored. You're free to marry the man I love, Theresa interrupted, moving to kneel before him. Mason, do you think my feelings for you were based on gratitude or necessity? The thought had occurred to me, he admitted. You were vulnerable when we met. I've worried that your affection might be obligatory. Theresa took his face between her hands. Then let me be absolutely clear. I love you for your heart, your integrity, your kindness. Whether I owned nothing or everything, that wouldn't change. Relief flooded his expression. So you still want to marry me, even though you don't need me to save your farm? I never needed you to save my farm, she smiled. I needed you to save my heart. And you did, the moment you saw me as a person worth dignity rather than a transaction. The wedding proceeded as planned on Christmas Eve. The ranch house was transformed with evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and countless candles that cast a warm glow over the proceedings. The local minister officiated before an assembly that included the entire ranch staff and their families, several neighboring ranchers, and even Judge Harrington, who had returned with his wife for the occasion. Theresa wore a gown of ivory, silk, a gift from Clara Winters, and the other ranch wives who had pooled their savings to purchase the fabric from a dressmaker in Fort Worth. Her hair was adorned with the blue ribbon Mason had bought her, now woven into a crown of winter flowers. Thomas gave his sister away, standing tall in his new suit, pride evident in his young face. Elizabeth served as maid of honor, carefully holding a bouquet matching Theresa's as she walked before her sister. When Theresa reached Mason at the makeshift altar before the fireplace, the love shining in his eyes brought tears to hers. Their vows, spoken with clear, steady voices, resonated through the hushed room, promises not just of love and fidelity, but of partnership, respect, and the building of a family that already included Thomas and Elizabeth. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister declared. Mr. Quinn, you may kiss your bride. The celebration continued long into the night. There was dancing in the cleared space of the main room, abundant food and drink, and toasts to the health and happiness of the newlyweds. As midnight approached, Mason and Theresa slipped away to the porch, seeking a moment of quiet together. Mrs. Quinn, Mason said softly, drawing her into his arms. How does it feel? Wonderful, Theresa replied, leaning into his embrace. Though perhaps I should be Mrs. Foster Quinn, now that my family name has been cleared. Whatever name you choose, You'll always be the woman who stole my heart at first sight, even when I was standing on an auction block," she teased gently. "Especially then," he said seriously. "Your dignity in that moment of indignity. I'd never seen such strength." They stood in companionable silence, watching the stars in the clear winter sky. The sounds of celebration continued behind them, the laughter of their friends and family, their community, a reassuring backdrop to this new beginning. "I've been thinking," Mason said eventually, "about the Foster farm. What about it? We could combine the properties. The Double Q and the Foster land would make a substantial ranch. We could build a new home there, perhaps, while maintaining this one for the ranch operations." Theresa considered the suggestion. "I'd like that. A fresh start on land that holds both our histories." "And Thomas could begin learning the business properly," Mason continued. "He has a natural gift for it. By the time he's grown, he could manage a significant portion himself." "You do that for him." Theresa looked up at her husband with gratitude. "I do that for our son," Mason corrected gently, "just as Elizabeth is now our daughter." Theresa's heart swelled at his words. "Our family," she whispered, leaning up to kiss him. "Our future." Spring brought new beginnings to the expanded Quinn Foster Ranch. Construction began on a new main house, situated on the boundary between the original properties, a symbolic joining of their separate histories into a shared future. The house was designed with growing children in mind, with 4 bedrooms upstairs and spacious common areas below. Theresa discovered she was expecting their first child in April, news that brought tears of joy to Mason's eyes when she told him one evening as they watched the sunset from their porch. His hand rested reverently on her still flat abdomen, as if already connecting with the new life growing within. "Boy or girl, this child will be so loved," he murmured. "By all 4 of us," Theresa agreed, thinking of how excited Thomas and Elizabeth had been upon hearing the news. The pregnancy progressed without complication through the summer months. Theresa maintained her oversight of the household, but delegated more physical tasks as her condition advanced. Mason grew increasingly protective, insisting she rest frequently and hiring additional help for the busiest periods of ranch work. In late November, just as the first winter chills settled over Texas, Theresa gave birth to a son they named James William Quinn, James for Mason's father, and William in recognition of Judge Harrington's role in restoring the Foster family's honor. The baby had Mason's blue eyes and Theresa's auburn hair, a perfect blending of his parents. Thomas, now 13, took his role as older brother seriously, proudly showing off little James to the ranch hands and neighbors who came to offer congratulations. Elizabeth, 11, appointed herself assistant nurse, helping Theresa with the baby's care and singing lullabies that their mother had once sung to them. As Christmas approached their first anniversary, and James's first Christmas, Mason surprised Theresa with news that the authorities had apprehended Howard Daniels in Mexico City. He would be returned to Texas to face charges of fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. "It's truly over now," Theresa said as they sat before the fire in their new home, baby James sleeping in her arms. Thomas and Elizabeth played a game of checkers nearby, their quiet laughter a counterpoint to the crackling flames. "Our family's name is fully cleared." "It was cleared the moment you held your head high on that auction block," Mason replied, his arm around her shoulders. "Your dignity could never be taken, only recognized." Theresa leaned into his embrace, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of despair on that hot summer day in Dallas to the warmth of family love surrounding them now, it seemed almost miraculous. You ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't been in Dallas that day? she asked. If you hadn't seen me at the general store or hadn't attended the auction, Mason considered the question. I believe some things are meant to be, he said finally. Had we not met then, perhaps our paths would have crossed elsewhere. The how matters less than the fact that we found each other. Such a romantic, Theresa teased, shifting James to her shoulder as he stirred. Only for you, Mason smiled, gently stroking his son's back. Only ever for you. The years passed, bringing both joy and challenges to the Quinn Foster ranch. Their family grew with the addition of a daughter, Caroline Elizabeth, born 2 years after James. The ranch prospered under Mason and Theresa's joint management, with Thomas increasingly taking on responsibility as he matured into a capable young man. Elizabeth blossomed into a thoughtful young woman with a talent for teaching, eventually taking over classes at the ranch school when Mrs. Winters retired. Her gentle patience with the youngest children and firm guidance of the older ones earned her respect throughout the community. 5 years after their wedding, Judge Harrington returned to the ranch with an unexpected proposal. He was retiring from the bench and hoped to nominate Mason for the position of circuit judge, a role that would allow him to help ensure justice was properly served throughout the region. You have a reputation for fairness and integrity, the judge told Mason as they discussed the possibility. And your experience with both ranching and banking gives you insight into the issues that most commonly come before the court. What about the ranch? Mason asked, glancing at Theresa. Our home is here. The circuit position would require travel, the judge acknowledged, but you could maintain your residence here. The court sessions rotate through the county seats on a monthly basis. Mason and Theresa discussed the proposal at length after the judge departed. The position would mean periods of separation, but it also represented an opportunity to prevent injustices like the one Theresa's family had suffered. You should accept, Theresa said finally. Thomas is almost 18 now and fully capable of managing the ranch in your absence. Elizabeth and I have the household well in hand, and the children would be proud to have their father serving as judge. You're certain? Mason searched her eyes. I won't do this if it places too great a burden on you. We built this life together, Theresa reminded him. Equal partners, remember. Your desire to serve justice is part of why I fell in love with you. I won't stand in the way of that calling. Mason was appointed to the bench the following spring. His first act as judge was to establish a legal aid service for those unable to afford representation, particularly women and children left vulnerable by the death or desertion of their male relatives. Theresa, meanwhile, founded a home for young women in difficult circumstances, providing shelter, education, and employment training. The memory of her own near fate drove her to create opportunities for others who might otherwise be forced into situations of dependency or exploitation. Together, they became known throughout the region not just as successful ranchers, but as champions of justice and compassion. Their children grew up witnessing the importance of using privilege to lift others, a legacy that shaped their own characters as they matured. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Mason and Theresa hosted a grand celebration at the ranch. Friends and family gathered from across Texas to honor the couple whose love story had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances. As twilight fell, they found themselves once again on the porch, watching the stars emerge while the sounds of celebration continued inside. Mason drew Theresa close, his love for her only deepened by the decade they had shared. 10 years ago, I bought a woman's freedom, he mused. Little knowing she would free my heart in return. We freed each other, Theresa corrected, her head resting on his shoulder, and built something neither of us could have created alone. Inside, Their children played with cousins and friends. Thomas discussed ranch business with neighboring cattlemen, and Elizabeth helped serve the anniversary cake she had baked herself. The home they had built together, both the physical structure and the family within it, stood as testament to the power of love to transform even the darkest circumstances into sources of light. To the next 10 years, Mason raised the glass of champagne he'd brought outside for this private toast. And the decades beyond. To our family, Theresa added, touching her glass to his. Born of honor restored and love freely given. As they sealed the toast with a kiss, both reflected on the remarkable journey from auction block to respected family. Their story, which had begun with shame and desperation, had blossomed into one of dignity, purpose, and abiding love, proof that even in the wild uncertainty of the frontier, hearts could find their true home in each other.